How a small shaving mirror, taped to a sniper's scope, shifted angles of sight and survival on a cold November morning in Metz, France. At 6:47 a.m. on November 3, 1944, Private First Class Michael Donovan crouched behind a collapsed bakery wall and watched through an 8-power scope as fog pooled low in the street like spilled wool. The scope delivered a narrow tube of the world, a choked view of cobblestones and a single broken window. Beyond that tiny slice, shadows lived and moved. Somewhere in that fog, men watched them back. Donovan's breath came out white against the glass. He had been awake since 2, listening for the sounds of winter settling into the ruined town. His hands, calloused from field repair and rifle work, did not shake. That steadiness was earned in hours of waiting, in counting of wind lines, in the long arithmetic of distance and bullet drop. It had not, he thought with a quiet hardness, kept Bradley or Chen alive. The morning report at battalion had been short and unsparing. 3 days earlier, Corporal James Bradley, 20, a boy from Nebraska with a laugh that came like a crack of clean wood, had been cut down while trying to hold a vantage on Rue de l'Église. Bradley's death arrived like a cold diagnosis, a gap in the roster, a place at mess with no one to fill it. 2 days after that, Private Robert Chen had been hit while he tried to cover a withdrawal. The medics worked on him for hours, the others standing with empty hands, as if there might be something to stitch back. Chen's slow passing left a residue of helplessness that sat on Donovan's shoulders like ballast. The battalion's sniper section had already paid a heavy price that autumn. In the weeks leading to November, the kill ratio had slid against them. By Donovan's count, and the reports stacked in the operations tent, 23 snipers had been lost across the front in October and early November. That number was not a ledger. It was a string of faces, of letters later written and never sent, of men who had walked into the same narrow field of view and not come home. He felt the scope as both a tool and a limit. A rifle with an 8-power optic offered clarity at distance, but forced the shooter into a tunnel. You could pick a thread and follow it to the end. You could not see what flanked it. That narrowness was fatal in streets and rubble, where enemies learned to move in slices. A head peered from a ruined stairwell. A muzzle flashed from a second-story hole. You could count bullets and sight lines and still miss the angle that killed you. Donovan understood the math. A scope might magnify the target, but it did not magnify the periphery. The enemy sniper could skirt out of the scope's cone on the 3rd step, cross the alley, and vanish. The problem was not only technical, it was tactical, and it had a name among the men: double position. He knew, in the same way every field improviser knows, that a precise blueprint could be dangerous in the wrong hands. What he did not do was write it down and scatter instructions. The modification was crude, transient, and wholly a soldier's gamble. When he came back to the bakery wall, the mirror lay flat beside his chevrons like a small metallic promise. Martinez looked at it and raised an eyebrow. "You gonna waggle it at 'em?" Martinez asked. "Not waggle," Donovan replied. "Just give the scope another eye, small." Martinez made a face that was partly skepticism and partly the soldier's private desire for anything that might save his skin. They both understood that saving skin required more than tricks. It required discipline and luck and the mercy of the line. But they also knew that cleverness had a place in war. The first mission with the mirror was planned for dawn patrol on November 8. Between November 3 and 8, there was time for doubt and for adjustments that were not recorded in any formal log. Donovan practiced in silence, aligning the reflective sliver until its angle gave a hint outside the scope's cone, without throwing a glare into his eye. He did not write instructions. He repeated the same thought over and over. Keep it subtle. A bright shine would be as deadly as a spotlight. On November 8, rain had left the streets slick and shining. The battalion moved slow and low. The enemy, they suspected, had realized something of their pattern, the narrow view of the scoped man, and had taken to jerry-rigging positions that punished it. Donovan and Martinez climbed into place above a stretch of open square where the ruined clock tower cast a long, broken shadow. The mirror was in place, his breathing an anchor. At 07:23, a dark shape moved along the far wall, a head and shoulders followed by a flash of a sleeve. Donovan's scope caught the target in precise, dangerous clarity. He had the angle, he had the shot. He also had the awareness that, a few steps to the left, at the mouth of an alley, another man could appear and change everything. He saw the contour in the mirror first, a reflection of a sleeve that the scope did not include, a soft line of fabric that suggested motion. He did not have time to think about doctrine. He squeezed, and the report rolled out, abrupt and contained. The first enemy sniper dropped. Martinez, watching to his left, answered with his own shot at a figure exposed while turning. 2 fall in quick sequence. There was no fanfare. There was only the tight, mechanical clarity of 2 men doing what they were trained to do, now augmented by a thin piece of glass and a quiet, stubborn will. The effect spread. Where Donovan's mirror gave a hint of movement, Martinez's crossfire exploited it. The angle that had been death for men like Bradley and Chen now became a vulnerability for the enemy. They did not stay long. The patrol rolled back, the men folding into the battalion's slow, trembling rhythm. He wanted something else, less loud, more enduring, the knowledge that a small device had saved men he could not bring back. The first real test of the modification's wider tactical importance came in mid-November patrols, when the battalion's kill ratio began to shift in a visible way. Between early October and the first weeks of November, the battalion had suffered more sniper losses than they were comfortable with. By the end of November, the balance had swung. Fewer friendly casualties, more enemy counterfire inflicted during patrols. It was not only the mirror, it was the consequence of adoption, of men learning to coordinate, to cover flanks, to expect a second eye. The mirror was a pivot, not a miracle. Donovan's guilt eased in the fractioned measure of survival. Some nights the weight remained, a dull ache he carried like an unhealed bruise. He visited Bradley's grave when he could, pausing at the simple wooden cross and thinking of the farm back home where the boy had wanted to raise corn and horses. He wrote to Chen's sister once, a short, careful letter that did not attempt consolation, but offered a truthful account of how brave the man had been in his last hours. Neither act unmade the death, but they shaped Donovan into a man who refused to let the names be only a statistic. After VE Day, the mirror's path into institutional memory took on the cold machinery of paper. Abadyne's reports were filed and refiled. Manuals changed slowly. Hayes, who had shielded the field inventors in the first months, later testified to the change in meetings with officers who would write directives. The file favors the neat line: improvement tested, doctrine adjusted. The namelessness of the inventor was the ordinary casualty of large systems. Decades later, an historian combing records in 1987 found a marginal note, a scribble at a proving ground chart pointing back to an unnamed battalion's field note. From that seed grew interviews and letters and an attempt to stitch a human thread into the dry weave of official documents. The historian tracked down Sam Martinez and Sergeant Wilson, now men with lines in their faces earned by other wars and long civilian years. Martinez remembered Donovan's hands working by lamplight, the tape sticky with cold. Wilson remembered badges and the feel of a good idea taking hold. Their testimonies formed a patchwork that gave a name to the object that had saved them. Donovan by then lived a life that suited him: quiet, hands into small, careful trades, a small house with a stubborn garden that would not die, a wife who knew half his moods and accepted the rest. He did not expect parades. He accepted letters, awkward and honorable, from men who wanted to say thank you for a life preserved. When Hayes traveled in 1992 to a small reunion and placed a hand on Donovan's shoulder, the captain's face showed the same practical grief that had guided him in '44. There was no ceremony. Only a folded moment of recognition that had the weight of late apologies. Not all things are reclaimed. The mirror itself, Donovan's mirror, battered and dulled, was eventually given to a small museum at Fort Benning, where artifacts of infantry life accumulate under glass. The plaque beside it noted only the device's function and the date. The historian's articles in 1989 and subsequent correspondence nudged that plaque toward a fuller sentence, a line about a private who improvised a reflective aid that demonstrably reduced sniper casualties in Mechettes in November 1944. It was modest language, the historian's attempt to put persons back into the dry grammar of records. Donovan died on June 7, 2001. The obituary in a hometown paper was no more expansive than he would have preferred. A mention of service, a list of survivors, a note about his calm disposition. People came to the funeral who had been saved by a man they had not known, and they left folded letters and soft, blunt thanks at the foot of his grave. The battalion's archive kept a notation now, an amendment of sorts, a historian's appendix that told a fuller story. For Donovan, it was never about being named. He had wanted fewer funerals, fewer nights that did not end in sleep. The mirror, small and simple, had been a solution thrown up against a wall of losses. It had been, in the end, a companion to the ethics of survival, the plain, difficult decision to put life first over procedure. The mirror as symbol stayed with those who remembered. In late afternoons, Martinez would sometimes rub at the tarnish on a palm and see, for a flash, the silver glint of the device catching an angle of sky. Wilson, sitting with a coffee in a mall, might tell a young veteran to pay attention to the flanks. The artifact at Fort Benning glinted its own tiny light behind glass, and visitors read, briefly, of a private's quiet act that shifted a small piece of the war. There remained questions that formal records could not answer. The exact emotion when Donovan first taped the mirror. The precise hesitation when he pressed the trigger at 0723. The private calculus in Hayes's eyes when he chose to shield and adopt without crediting. Those were the fragments the historian found and pieced together with interviews and letters, but they remained, inevitably, guesses made plausible by testimony. In the months after the mirror's wider use, the battalion's casualty reports told a different story. Not every patrol ended with clean outcomes. War kept making demands. But the narrow tunnel of the scope was no longer as absolute a sentence. Men who learned to watch the sides survived more often. The little device had not changed the war's course, but it had changed the course of individual lives. A soldier's son who would be born 3 months later. A letter never dispatched. A face that would age into memory rather than a number. Donovan lived long enough to see the artifact placed under glass.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: He visited once, quietly, with Martinez at his side. They stood a moment before the display, and Donovan, hands folded, felt suddenly foolish and proud in the same breath. The mirror had been a plain thing. Under the museum light, it looked almost mythic, and yet the plaque's words were honest and small. It suited him. When the historian published the fuller account in 1989, there was a modest ripple among enthusiasts and a quiet nod from a few veterans groups. The greater machinery of military history moved on to other innovations and other narratives. Memory is a crowded room, and only so many chairs exist. In a letter Donovan never mailed, he wrote of Bradley and Chen and the thing he had done. He closed the page with one sentence, that the small acts, repairs, patches, a mirrored hint, were how people kept each other from vanishing. That thought carried him through winters and into the long evening of his life. The mirror remained a lesson about sight, that to look and to see are different, and that sometimes saving a life depends on noticing the thin edges the rules overlook. It remained a lesson about credit, too. Institutions codify, but they seldom remember the hands that started the change. This is why it mattered. Because one private, moved by grief and a stubborn insistence that the next man should not die for lack of an extra eye, altered the math of survival for his comrades. The rest, the formal reports, the proving grounds tests, the historian's articles, simply made space in the record for a name that had briefly been almost lost. November turned to winter, and Metz sunk under a quieter gray. Donovan kept his hands busy and his stories short. He would not be the kind to claim heroics. He would, at the end of his life, accept a small letter from a man who had once been saved. In it, the writer said simply that he had a child because of what Donovan had done. The private folded the paper and kept it in his shirt pocket for a week. Beyond the personal, the mirror's arc touched an older truth, that innovation at the edges, born of grief, necessity, and the refusal to accept the unchangeable, often travels by example before it ever finds its place in doctrine. The battalion's other snipers adapted in their own ways, adding slivers of metal, changing watch positions, altering withdrawal protocols. Each small change aggregated into a difference that showed up in numbers and in mess tables and in the count of letters sent home. There would be more tests, more formal evaluations, and eventually a discreet placement of mention in training manuals. Donovan's name would appear in footnotes and oral histories, and for a brief while, the man who had once crouched and watched through a tube would be more than a shadow on a roster. Yet even when history remembered him, it did so with the soft humility the subject himself had lived by. The mirror, then, held value beyond its reflective surface.
It refracted a moral question into a human answer. When the cost of waiting is a friend, what do you do? Donovan chose to act. He chose a small, dangerous fix. He chose to trust his judgment over a rule that had not saved Bradley. That choice saved lives. It also left him with a quiet burden, the knowledge of what had been lost and a cautious, private satisfaction that he had done what he could. The street in Metz where the first successful engagement took place remained as rubble and memory. Men who passed there later would not know its small role in a broader tactical shift. They would not see the shine that had once found an angle and redirected fate. But those who had been there, Martinez, Wilson, the men Donovan saved, carried the knowledge in their bones. By January 1945, the battalion's reports reflected the trend. By May 8, 1945, when the wider war in Europe drew to its long, complicated close, Donovan had returned home and found work that required patience and calluses. The world that welcomed him was not the one he had left. It was quieter, and its definitions of service were looser and more fragile. He kept his head down and his hands busy. The historian's rediscovery in 1987 and subsequent publications nudged the official record. Hayes's visit in 1992, simple, unceremonious, honest, felt to Donovan like a small settling of accounts. He did not live for accolades. He lived for the knowledge that a trick of light had made a difference. When people ask about the impossible shot in later retellings, there is always a desire for drama, the impossible angle, the clean miracle. The truth is less cinematic and more human. The shot was not impossible because the rifle was extraordinary. It was possible because a man refused to accept narrow sight as fate, and gave his scope an extra eye. It was an act of craft and courage, not of glamour. Donovan's life after the war was a study in quiet continuities. He mended fences and patched roofs. He volunteered at a school when asked and refused plaques when offered. He treasured the letters, the brief visits, the small, steady acknowledgments that came like late rain. He died with the mirror's image reflected in the eyes of those who had known him, not glorious, simply grateful. Memory, in the end, demands modest acts of stewardship. The historian's work in the late 80s did not unmake the bureaucratic past, but it put a name back into a place that had almost been anonymous. It asked readers to notice. The little things that change how men live are worth preserving. There were, inevitably, skeptics and those inclined to tidy narratives into official breakthroughs. Donovan's story resists neatness. It is threaded through with grief and practical salvage, with a captain's quiet pragmatism and a private's refusal to let rules over life. It is about the small human choices that tilt outcomes, and the way institutions sometimes swallow credit while keeping the effect.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: Meti-me swallow credit while keeping the effect. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Donovan's name is not everywhere. It is not on an enormous monument. It is on a plaque and in a few articles and in the folded letters that families kept. That is enough for some men. For Donovan, perhaps it was more than enough. Even now, when the wind moves through the ruins of places left by war, the mirror remains a small symbol, a reminder that widening one's vision, literally and figuratively, can spare a life. It is not a grand moral. It is a quiet fact. The story continues in the memories of those who lived it, in the ink of historians who chased down margins, and in the slow change of doctrine that sometimes learns from the edges. It lives in the way small acts, driven by grief and ingenuity, can ripple outward and alter the arithmetic of survival. And it lives in the echo of a single morning in November, when a private, crouched behind a ruined wall, took a risk and added a second eye to his scope. The young man traced the letters until the metal warmed under his fingertip, and for a brief moment the plaque ceased to be brass and became memory, a private map of a life revised. He thought of his grandfather, how the old man had kept his mouth closed about weather, about grief, about favors received and debts unpaid. And he understood, without rhetoric, how gratitude sometimes lives as a quiet economy. He left the museum with the impression of an ordinary object rendered uncanny by story, a thing that had been at once tool and testimony. Across decades and geographies, small acts continued to reposition the world. A training manual amended a paragraph here. A sergeant adjusted a practice there. None of the changes announced themselves as monuments. Doctrines shifted in the margins, teachers conferred over coffee, and a handful of men in forward positions began to think differently about what their optics could do. Those alterations did not bear Donovan's name in every mouth, but they carried his method's consequence, pragmatism braided with compassion, into futures he would never see. Families, meanwhile, kept other kinds of record. The letters Donovan had saved moved from desk drawer to shoebox to frame. A granddaughter put one under glass on a mantel. Soldiers who owed their lives to that extra eye visited cemeteries, wrote brief notes to men who had no one left to receive them, and told their sons what they could in kitchen light and between mouthfuls of bread. Stories curdle into myth more easily than gratitude does. Gratitude is stubborn and domestic. It lives in recipes, in calls on birthdays, in the habit of standing when an old friend enters a room.
Therefore, houve reckonings too. Critics argued that the mirror story romanticized improvisation and circumvented command. Others insisted on the invisible labor of those who made doctrine safe long after bullets stopped flying. Clerks, quartermasters, the steady people who translated one man's improvisation into an accepted practice. Donovan never demanded that nuance be erased. He accepted the messiness that follows any honest life. He had learned, in his own half-shuttered way, that virtue gleamed in small choices more often than it did in medals. Late in life, he would sometimes tell, to those who asked, how the mirror had once looked back at him and made him feel less alone. The tone was never boastful. It was the flat reporting of a man aware that luck and will shake hands in the dark. When friends spoke of courage, Donovan would laugh at the word and say instead that he had been stubborn. And stubbornness is not as noble as it sounds. It is often an insistence against the easy thing.
to obey, to look away, to keep to the line. The mirror represented a refusal to keep to the line when the line meant death. The instrument itself retained its quiet authority. Years layered on it like dust and then were cleaned away. The glass acquired the faint, pitted look of objects that have been used rather than polished for display. In that ware there was testimony. Not that a miracle had happened, but that a necessity had been met by a human hand. Teachers pointed to it as an example in classes on fieldcraft. Grandchildren asked the questions children ask. Was it heavy? Was he scared? And the answers multiplied in the telling. If there is a final shape to Donovan's tale, it is not a tidy legacy, but a pattern. One man's refusal to accept narrow sight expanded into a habit of seeing for others. That habit, unremarkable and persistent, quietly altered the way some men approached danger. It did not make war kinder, nor did it pretend to. It simply held that when a man widens his vision, when he lends his eye to another, he changes, in small but real ways, the arithmetic of survival. On the cold mornings when wind still walks through ruined streets, the mirror waits in its case, like an ordinary relic of an extraordinary thrift. A small machine, a slight shift in angle, a decision made in a crouch. It asks nothing of us but attention, and sometimes that is enough.